Okay, let's try and unpack this. Picture this scenario. A young, married couple, maybe just starting out,
Hmm.
and maybe they're both only children. Now, here's the twist. They don't just have one home.
Right.
They actually have two separate apartments.
Yeah, that's the setup.
One may be provided by her parents, the other by his. And they don't just, pick one. They live in both.
Moving back and forth, yeah.
It sounds, different, maybe a bit complicated.
It can seem that way on the surface, definitely.
But based on the material we've been digging into, this isn't just some isolated, quirky thing. It's apparently an emerging practice in Chinese cities. It even has a name.
Liang Tu Dun.
Liang Tudan, which literally means
Two places to stay.
two places to stay. Simple enough translation, but implies a lot.
It really does.
So in this deep dive, we're going to explore what Liang Tudan actually involves, where it came from, and maybe most importantly, how it's reshaping some really fundamental ideas about marriage, family.
And inheritance, too. It touches on all of that.
Exactly. Our mission here is to really get to grips with this for you listening, understand the surprising details and what it all might mean.
And what the research really emphasizes is that this isn't like just a lifestyle choice some people are making for fun.
Yeah.
No, it seems to be a pretty direct response to some powerful economic and social shifts happening.
Okay.
So, at its core, Lang Tu Dun, it describes this situation. A married couple maintains two separate homes. Often, gifted by each set of parents.
And they don't just merge into one main home eventually.
Not necessarily. They actively use both, dividing their time. It's quite deliberate.
Huh.
And a really key detail the material points to is that the couple's doing this. Very often, they're both only children.
Ah, okay. So that specific demographic point is crucial.
It seems central to understanding why this specific practice is emerging, yes.
That connection to the only child generation is fascinating. It hints that it's about more than just, property. But why now? Why this solution? What's the sort of historical, economic context that makes Liang Tudun make sense or even possible?
Well, if you look at the background the sources provide, you really have to go back to China's economic reforms starting around 1978.
Right, the opening up.
Exactly. And over the decades since then, many families managed to accumulate quite significant private wealth.
Okay.
And with that new wealth came, perhaps unsurprisingly, a new concern. How do we keep this wealth within our family? How do we pass it down our lineage?
Makes sense. Preserve what you've built.
But then that financial concern sort of collided head-on with another huge demographic force.
Let me guess, the one-child policy,
You got it. Implemented broadly from 1980 right into 2015.
which had massive consequences.
Huge. And one key consequence was a large number of families ending up with only daughters.
And traditionally,
Traditionally, lineage, inheritance, carrying on the family name that was all strongly tied to having sons. Very much so. So for these families with only daughters, ensuring their family line continued and making sure their hard-earned wealth stayed connected to that line became a real pressing issue.
right, so you've got this new wealth you want to protect, but the traditional path for doing that, passing it through a son who carries the name, isn't always available because of the policy.
Precisely. A real dilemma for many.
So before this Liang Tudun idea emerged, what was the established way for a family without a son to handle this? Was there a traditional mechanism?
There was.
Mm-hmm.
The research described the dominant norm historically as patriarchal marriage.
Meaning the wife moves in with the husband's family?
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
She married into his family, lived with or near them, and critically, their children took the father's surname.
Okay, standard practice in many places.
Right. And interestingly, while Chinese women kept their birth names after marriage historically, the children always got the father's name. This patronymic naming, it was historically tied up with consolidating property under male owners. Though it's worth noting that specific legal link between names and property inheritance was broken after 1949 when private property was abolished for a time.
But the custom itself persisted.
Very strongly. The naming custom remained the norm.
Okay, so that's the standard. But what if a family didn't have a son? What was their traditional fix?
For that situation, the sources describe a practice called zaosu.
Zaosu. Okay, what does that involve?
It's essentially a marriage where the man marries into the wife's family, sometimes called an indwelling marriage.
Marrying into her family, so a reversal of the usual patrilocal setup.
Exactly. It flips the script.
What did that look like in practice?
Well, in a zaosu marriage, the couple would typically live with the wife's family, or very nearby. And here's the absolutely crucial part for lineage.
The children's names.
Yes, the children would take the mother's surname.
Ah, so that's how her family line continued.
Precisely. And the research notes that the man who agreed to a Zhaosu marriage often came from a family that had other sons.
So his own family's lineage wasn't lost by him marrying out, so to speak.
Right. His family line was secure. And often, the wife's family would provide quite significant resources for this kind of marriage.
Like what?
The wedding apartment, furniture, maybe a dowry, covering the wedding costs, basically taking on the financial aspects usually expected of the groom's side.
Because they needed this arrangement to work.
Yes. And because the daughter, often an only daughter in this scenario, became absolutely essential, not just for continuing the family name via her children, but also for fulfilling the duty of caring for her elderly parents, a role that traditionally fell to sons.
So the Zhaosu son-in-law helped fill that gap too.
Exactly. It was the established solution for families without sons to maintain their line and ensure elder care.
Okay, that makes sense as a traditional workaround. So
Yeah.
how does laying to done, the two places to stay idea, fit in? How is it different, especially for these couples where both partners are only children?
This is exactly where laying to done comes in, as the source material explains it. It's positioned as an alternative path, especially compared to Zhaosu.
An alternative because both are only children.
That seems to be the key driver. Think about it. If both the husband and wife are sole heirs, neither set of parents might be keen on their child completely leaving their sphere of influence and fully integrating into the other family's structure, whether that's patrilic or via Zhaosu.
Right, both sets of parents want to maintain a strong connection and ensure their own family continuity.
Precisely. So laying to done with each set of parents often contributing an apartment.
Allows the couple to avoid fully merging into just one family unit.
Exactly. They maintain active, close ties with both sets of parents, both family lines, by physically dividing their time between the two homes.
It's a way to sort of honor both sides, stay connected to both parental homes.
That seems to be a major part of the logic. It navigates that tricky situation where both families have strong claims and concerns.
It really sounds like a new kind of family structure, almost stretched across two centers of gravity.
In a way, yes.
But what happens with the kids? You mentioned lineage was key. How does this setup handle children's names and their relationships with all four grandparents?
Ah, yes, the children.
Yeah.
This is where laying to done introduces what the research calls a really significant innovation, especially around naming,
Okay.
particularly if the couple has, say, 2 children.
What happens then?
The study describes a common arrangement emerging, one specifically designed to, well, satisfy both sets of grandparents and continue both lineages.
Ow.
One child takes the father's surname,
Okay, the traditional way for that one.
and the other child takes the mother's surname.
Wait, seriously, siblings with different last names? One from dad's side, one from mom's?
That's the arrangement being described.
Wow, that feels like a huge departure from the historical norm you laid out earlier, outside of that specific Zhaosu context.
It really is. Taking the mother's surname is, generally speaking, highly unconventional in China. But it's happening within this new laying to done structure.
Who decides which kid gets which name? The parents.
The parents, yes. But the source material also highlights that the grandparents often play a really significant role in this decision.
Ah, the influence of the elders. What factors into that choice?
Several things seem to come into play. Tradition still holds weight, so the firstborn, especially if it's a son, is apparently quite likely to take the father's name.
Because of that historical emphasis on the male line continuing the paternal name.
Exactly. That impulse is still strong. However,
Is a however?
there is. The material indicates that if the wife's family happens to have, say, notably higher social standing or greater economic resources than the husband's family,
Then,
then the firstborn, even if a son, might actually end up taking the mother's name instead.
so status and wealth can override the traditional patrilineal preference in some cases.
It seems it can influence the outcome, yes. It's a negotiation.
Okay, this naming convention is fascinating. But does it? Does it have other consequences?
This leads to what the analysis flags as a really crucial point. The potential for, well, inequality between the siblings.
Inequality. How so?
The research suggests a pattern where grandparents tend to, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps consciously, provide more resources.
Resources like.
Things like helping fund education, paying for extracurriculars or leisure activities, maybe covering extra medical costs. They tend to channel these resources primarily towards the grandchild who shares their specific surname.
Oh, wow. So the kid with the father's last name gets more support, financial or otherwise, from the paternal grandparents.
And the child with the mother's last name gets more from the maternal grandparents. That's the tendency observed.
That's really quite unexpected. You'd think they'd treat grandkids equally.
You might think so, but the name seems to act as a powerful symbol of lineage connection, influencing where those intergenerational resources flow.
And the consequence of that.
The consequence described is potentially quite significant for the children's futures. These differences in access to grandparental resources
Yeah.
mean that the siblings' opportunities down the line, things like the quality of education they can access, maybe even their career paths or social networks, might end up reflecting the different financial or social endowments of their respective grandparents.
Rather than just their shared background from their immediate parents.
Exactly. It introduces a potential divergence based on which surname they carry.
That's a remarkable ripple effect from what starts as a living arrangement and a naming solution.
Yeah.
So, if we synthesize everything the source material is telling us, what does Lang to Dun fundamentally represent? How should we understand it?
Well, it's described as, yes, a new form of marriage structure, definitely, but it's more than that. It's also a new approach to naming siblings, a new way of doing family life day to day, and really a genuine innovation in how generations relate to each other.
An innovation born out of navigating these specific modern pressures.
Yes, navigating the realities of wealth accumulation, family lineage concerns, and the demographic fallout of the one-child generation, particularly for those couples who are themselves only children.
And for you listening, why should you care about this specific practice in Chinese cities? What's the takeaway?
I think it vividly shows how even deeply embedded cultural traditions, ideas about family, who you belong to, how inheritance works, aren't set in stone.
They adapt.
They adapt, sometimes in really creative and unexpected ways, in response to big economic and social shifts. It highlights the ingenious solutions families come up with to manage new challenges.
Like balancing the needs and expectations of two sets of equally invested parents when both have only one child.
Exactly. But also shows how these solutions can, perhaps unintentionally, create brand new complexities.
Like this potential for inequality between siblings based on a name and grandparental investment.
Right. Sharing the same parents, same households,
Yeah.
but potentially having different resource landscapes shaping their futures.
So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with.
Consider this. Here's a practice, Liang Tu Den, partly designed to preserve lineage and wealth and connection across two families, right?
Right, bridging the gap.
But in achieving that, could it inadvertently be sowing new kinds of division, or at least difference, maybe even inequality, within the very nuclear family it's helping to create?
A family united by marriage but potentially divided by name and resource flow.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does that tell us about the persistent power of names, lineage, and how resources get passed down or not across the generations, even in the face of massive societal change?